There are words written in the shadow of death that carry more love than a lifetime of ordinary conversation. And some of those words never reach the people they were meant to save. In archives, sealed for decades, letters rest in envelopes that were never opened. Final words from people who knew they were dying and wanted to leave something behind for those they loved. These are not historical documents. They are heartbeats frozen in ink. The last thoughts of human beings who faced the end and chose to spend their final moments writing home. What you're about to hear is the story of a letter that traveled through decades instead of miles. That arrived too late to comfort, but just in time to prove that love endures beyond silence. In 1943, a young man named Thomas was arrested in occupied France for resistance activities, and he knew from the moment they took him that he would not survive. He was 24 years old, a teacher before the war, a son who wrote to his mother every week until the week he was captured and the letters suddenly stopped arriving. His mother, Marie, lived in a small village and waited every day for the postman, believing that eventually a letter would come explaining where Thomas was and when he would return home. She waited through the rest of the war, through the liberation, through the years after when other families learned what had happened to their missing sons and daughters finally. But no word came about Thomas. No confirmation of death. No body to bury. Nothing but absence that stretched across years and hardened into a grief without closure or resolution. Marie died in 1968, 25 years after her son disappeared, still believing that somewhere there might be an explanation she never received from anyone who knew. What she didn't know was that Thomas had written to her, had poured everything into a final letter the night before his execution, had given it to a guard who promised to mail it. The guard kept the letter, along with dozens of others written by condemned prisoners, either out of cruelty or fear or some twisted sense that these words were evidence to be hidden. When the war ended, those letters were collected by occupation forces and filed away in military archives under classifications that would keep them sealed for half a century of silence. They were evidence of war crimes, of executions, of identities that needed to be confirmed before families could be notified. Or so the official justification claimed when pressed decades later. But the real reason they were hidden was bureaucratic inertia, the same force that buries truth under procedure, that lets important things gather dust while families wait for answers forever. Thomas's letter sat in a box in a military archive in Paris, one among thousands, unread by anyone who loved him, unknown to the mother who died waiting for it. The letter was 3 pages long, written in pencil on paper that had yellowed but remained intact, his handwriting steady despite what he knew was coming in the morning. He began with the words, "Maman, by the time you read this, I will be gone. But I need you to know that my last thoughts were of you and home, and everything you taught me." He wrote about his childhood, about memories of learning to read at her knee, about the garden where she grew vegetables and the way the house smelled of bread on Sunday mornings. He wrote about his regrets, that he would not be there to care for her in her old age, that he would not give her grandchildren, that he had caused her this terrible pain. He wrote about his lack of regret for what he had done, for the choices that led to his arrest, for standing against occupation even though it cost him everything, including his life. He told her he was not afraid, which was a lie meant to comfort her because he was terrified, but he wanted her to believe he faced the end with courage and dignity. He asked her to forgive him for leaving her alone, for not being more careful, for choosing a path that led to this cell and this final night of writing by dim light. And he ended with the words, "I love you more than I have words to express, and I will carry that love with me wherever I go after this. Thank you for every moment of my life." Marie never read those words, never knew that Thomas had thought of her at the end, never received the comfort of knowing he died with her name on his lips and in his heart. She was buried in the village cemetery under a stone that listed her son as missing, because without confirmation of death, she could not let herself believe he was truly gone forever. If this story is touching something deep in your heart, if you understand the weight of words that arrive too late, consider joining this community where we honor forgotten voices and hidden truths. For 70 years, Thomas's letter remained in that archive, filed under his prisoner number, unconnected to his name in any database that his surviving family might have searched desperately. His younger sister, who had been 12 when he was taken, grew old, never knowing what happened to her brother, beyond the vague understanding that he had not come home. She searched sporadically over the decades, writing to veterans' organizations and historical societies, but she had few details, and the records were deliberately obscured by classification rules. In 2013, a French historian researching resistance executions petitioned for access to wartime correspondence held in military archives and finally received permission to examine sealed boxes. What he found were hundreds of letters written by condemned prisoners, political detainees, captured resistance fighters, all saying goodbye to people who never knew they had tried to send final words. He began the painstaking work of trying to identify the writers and locate surviving family members who might want to receive letters written 70 years earlier by people long dead. Thomas's letter was among them, and through prisoner records, the historian was able to determine his full name and hometown, and from there to trace his surviving family members alive. His sister was 92 years old, living in a care facility, her memory fading but still sharp when it came to her brother, who had disappeared when she was just a child. The historian contacted her family and explained what he had found, asking if she would want to receive the letter or if it would be too painful after so many years of silence. Her daughter said yes without hesitation, understanding that her mother had lived her entire life with an open wound that might finally close if she could hear her brother's voice again. They arranged for the historian to visit, to bring the letter personally, to be there in case the emotion was too overwhelming for a woman in her 90s to process alone. He arrived on a grey afternoon in November, carrying a folder with the original letter carefully preserved in an archival sleeve, and sat with the family in a small, sunlit room. Thomas's sister, whose name was Isabel, held the letter in shaking hands and stared at the handwriting she recognized instantly, despite 7 decades of separation from it completely. She wept before reading a single word. Just seeing his writing was enough to break open the grief she had carefully contained for most of a century of not knowing for certain. Her daughter read it aloud while Isabel closed her eyes and listened to her brother's voice reaching across 70 years of silence to say the goodbye he had tried to send. When the reading finished, Isabel sat in silence for a long time, tears streaming down her face, holding the letter against her chest as if she could physically embrace her brother through the paper. She said that her mother had never stopped waiting, had never stopped watching the road, had never accepted that he was truly gone without some final word to make it real and bearable. She said it wasn't fair that the letter had been kept from them, that her mother had died without this comfort, that bureaucracy had stolen even this small mercy from a grieving family. The historian apologized on behalf of institutions that would never apologize themselves, acknowledging that there was no justification for hiding these letters for 70 years from the people they were meant to reach. Isabel asked if she could keep the original, and of course the answer was yes. It belonged to her family, it had always belonged to them, it should never have been taken. She placed it in a frame and hung it on her wall, the last words of a brother she had loved and lost. Proof that he had thought of home at the end and wanted them to know. She lived another 2 years after receiving the letter, and her family said that those 2 years were different, that some tension she had carried her entire life finally released after that reading. She had spent 80 years not knowing if her brother had suffered, if he had been afraid, if he had thought of them, and the letter answered those questions even as it broke her heart. The historian found and delivered 37 more letters over the next 5 years, reuniting final words with families who had lived decades believing their loved ones had died in silence without goodbye. Some of the families were grateful, some were angry that the letters had been withheld. Some were both, grieving and grateful and furious at institutions that had stolen this from them for generations. Each letter told a similar story, a person facing death who chose to spend their final moments trying to reach across the distance to tell someone they loved them one last time completely. A father writing to his daughter, telling her to be brave and kind, and to remember him not as a prisoner, but as the man who danced with her in the kitchen on Sunday mornings. A young woman writing to her parents, apologizing for the worry she caused them, thanking them for raising her with principles that she refused to abandon even when they cost her life. A husband writing to his wife, giving her permission to love again, to not spend her life in mourning, to remember their years together as joy and not as tragedy afterward. These were not historical figures. They were ordinary people, caught in extraordinary circumstances, trying to leave something of themselves behind for the people who would have to live without them. And their words were hidden, not for security reasons, not to protect anyone, but because systems designed to process death in wartime are not designed to care about love or grief. The letters were evidence, they were data points, they were pieces of a larger picture that historians and prosecutors might someday need. But they were not seen as human voices that deserved to be heard. So they sat in boxes while mothers died waiting, while children grew old wondering, while spouses remarried and had other lives but never stopped carrying the absence of goodbye, never spoken. Thomas's letter is not unique. It is representative of thousands that were never delivered, tens of thousands possibly, scattered across archives in every country that fought in that war and others. How many final words are still sitting in sealed files? How many families are still waiting without knowing they're waiting? How many voices have been silenced by bureaucracy and classification, even now? The historian who found Thomas' letter has made it his life's work to locate and deliver as many as possible, racing against time as surviving family members age and die without closure. He says the hardest part is delivering letters to people who say their parent or sibling or spouse died believing they were forgotten, died without knowing they had been remembered with such love. He carries the weight of those decades of unnecessary grief, wondering why it took 70 years for anyone to think that maybe these letters should be returned to the people they were written for. But he also carries the gratitude of families who finally get to hear the voices they thought were lost forever, who finally get to close the wound that had been bleeding for decades. Isabel died holding Thomas's letter, her daughter said, as if she was taking it with her to show her mother, to prove that he had tried to reach them, that he had loved them at the end. And perhaps that is the only comfort in this story, that eventually the words found their way home, late but not lost, that love persisted despite every attempt to bury it in silence. The archive where Thomas's letter was held has since been reorganized, and a project is underway to digitize and identify all remaining undelivered correspondence from that era and others before and after. But the work is slow, underfunded, dependent on volunteers and historians who care more about human stories than institutional priorities, and many letters will remain undelivered until everyone who could receive them has died. This is what happens when systems prioritize order over compassion, when procedure becomes more important than the people the procedure is supposedly designed to serve in the first place. Thomas wrote his letter believing it would reach his mother, believing that his final act of love would be delivered, that she would know he thought of her at the end. The guard who took the letter and never sent it is long dead. Beyond accountability, beyond judgment, his choice to keep it lost to history, along with his reasons or justifications for doing so. The officials who classified these letters and filed them away are also dead. Their decisions made in wartime chaos but perpetuated through decades of bureaucratic inertia that no one questioned deeply enough. And Marie died without knowing that her son had tried to say goodbye, that 3 pages of his love for her existed in the world, sitting in a box just waiting for someone to care enough to deliver them. That is the tragedy beyond the execution, beyond the war. That final act of cruelty inflicted not by enemies, but by institutions that should have protected the connection between the dying and the living. But the letter exists now in Isabel's family, passed down to her children and grandchildren, a tangible connection to an uncle and great-uncle they never met but who lives in his words forever. They read it on anniversaries, on memorial days, on quiet evenings, when they want to remember that their family's history includes someone who chose courage over safety and died for it without regret. Thomas's voice has outlived the systems that tried to silence it, has reached his family even though it took 70 years, has proven that love is more persistent than bureaucracy or classification or time. And somewhere in archives around the world, other letters wait, other final words sit in boxes, other families live without closure, because no one has prioritized delivering messages from the dead to the living. Every one of those letters is a Thomas, a person who faced death and chose to write to someone they loved, who believed their words would be delivered and bring some comfort to their grief. Every one of those letters is a Marie, waiting for a message that exists but never arrives, dying without knowing that their loved one thought of them at the very end of everything. This is not ancient history. This is ongoing. There are letters being hidden right now under classifications, and procedures, voices being silenced in the name of security or order or institutional convenience always. And there are families waiting right now, not knowing that the words they long for already exist, that somewhere in a sealed file is the goodbye they thought they would never receive at all. Thomas's letter ends with the words, "I will love you forever," and he has, his love preserved in ink and paper, outlasting the war, outlasting the archive, finally reaching the family it was always meant for. Have you ever received words that arrived too late to change anything but still changed everything? Or are you still waiting for a message from someone who is gone that you hope might somehow still find you?